Welcome to day 3 of Experimenter Curators Hub, the 8th edition. Those of you who have been returning, this is the last sort of roundup. Thank you for staying through the 3 days. We do see this continuity as an inherent value to this format. So thank you for your time. And those of you who are joining today, I'm going to do just a short brief on some of the points that have been discussed yesterday by our presenters, and also a way to lead us into a sort of concluding discussion which will take place after the third presentation of today. So Josh, I'm not sure how many made it to see the blood moon last night. I missed it, but sort of thinking of that moon and to wake us up a little bit, I wanted to show you this this image of a sun-bearing peri riding on a composite lion. And I was thinking also of the four-headed sphinx that Oval showed us, and sort of this idea also of finding value in composite thinking and composite being, and of a sort of a planetary alliance. So what are these kind of modes of hybridity, plurality that we can sort of think through within cosmological being, but also forms of entwinement between sort of human, animals, and monstrosities. This miniature just sort of represents the conjunction of the sun with the constellation Leo. But I'm just sort of showing you this, this 18th century work simply as a sort of starting point, also because Kavita Singh is the expert and she's sort of amidst us today, so also sort of to move a little bit from the contemporary into different forms of image making. Yesterday, Prasad Shetty and Rupali Gupte started by informing us of how their research and their sort of exercises in looking at urban development and urban forms of the city dwells on the corroded edges and the blurs, the lines of movement, the sort of degrees of informal economy and the corporate capitalism, and where they basically intersect within us as sort of city dwellers, while also sort of thinking about the more hidden aspects of transactional capacities and the affective substance of kinship and care that must run against the logic of cellularization of life, of what it means to invent guerrilla tactics of survival and address towards maintaining porosity, not only in the architecture. They showed us this sort of house as this forest house, an example in Bombay, but how may we achieve that? And this is a sort of question that needs to be thought through further, of course, through some of the kind of discussions that came up. How do we think about this porosity as a possibility at a communal level within the kind of social disparities that prevail? Luli, who is going to present today, has been also asking potent questions from the audience, and today he will have a chance to speak and share his practice with you. But some of those questions were on how to mobilize the potential of moving beyond nation-based territoriality through the grammar of the archive in terms of its construction, in terms of its access, and also in exhibition making, such that there isn't simply a consumptive relation toward indigenous inclusion and indigenous sovereignties as sort of positioned as formal sort of figureheads of practice under the pressure of political correctness, but instead to rupture the ontological framework and to really think about more sustained networks in which indigenous knowledge can circulate, and truly not thinking about it as a marginal practice, because it is not. And it is the power dynamics that actually sort of push it at those edges from which it must fight each time. Oval also encouraged us to think about curating as a form of resilience, and thought through what sort of immune systems we need to build today, which includes modes of solidarity. And she encouraged us in her projects also to think through queerness as a mode of opaque alliance, to think about that queerness across different generations of practice, as she has. Jubesh sort of also prompted to move, if we have to move beyond sort of opacity and transparency in terms of glissance thinking, and within the context in India, what are the graded thresholds of illegibility in which we exist and which inform our existence and its unevenness. Orville also shared some compelling practices. So I'd mentioned the artist Gulsun Kara Mustafa, whose work you're encouraged to sort of look into, and also what it has meant to commission projects within the public space of Istanbul with artists such as Banu Şenitoglu, whose project, The List, is something that is in constant progress and sort of talks about the realm of displacement and dispossession as not something that is seen within the kind of limit of a refugee crisis, but literally something that is happening from a much longer time span and within a much larger geography, and how we are all basically responsible and in it. And what it means then to sort of broadcast that across different formats, to stream that on the Yama screen, which is in the middle of Istanbul, now closed under political pressure, and currently this project being in Liverpool, as she cited. Adam Shumshek has been with us now for the second time, and we discussed Documenta 14. Sort of a member from the audience brought up how it is an exhibition that has been termed as exhausting by design, what it actually means to be in exhibitions that can be informative, transformatory grounds, but at the same time also deeply exhausting, what it actually, if we even want to make that effort in the times we are in, where there are different priorities. So how must the exhibition also wrestle for attention, and at the same time, for us as curators, to not submit or surrender to the pressure of thinking about audience figures within mega exhibition formats, and the audience as a scheme of numbering and as a sort of taxonomy as such. This also then, this kind of defying of those pressures obviously has also repercussions, which we basically know are surrounding the narrative of this exhibition. But what we wish to do was to also share with you the process of making it and the many channels through which it circulated, which was, as Adam mentioned, the public exhibition site, radio, television, the website, and the various publications, some of which are also accessible online. The Parliament of Bodies was another sort of ground of thinking through what kinds of publics can be produced as open form constituencies that are in shift, and how to move away from streams of hyper circulation. This is something we're asking ourselves, and disengaging with the artistic practice as a generic roll call of names. And this is Adam sort of thinking what it means to take on the curatorial task of becoming familiar with that which is not known to you, rather than that which has been established as part of your curatorial signature, and how it is within that moment that fragility is basically the key condition. What does it mean to think about producing an exhibition such as Documenta as a seriality of fragile moments, along with a large team, and to choose to speak from the position of we? We've also talked about how artistic and cultural practitioners are not only performing within infrastructure, but are becoming infrastructure themselves in a lot of different contexts. And I'd cite Aaron Gleason's work in Cambodia and a lot of other work that also happens within the sort of the informal life of art, where becoming infrastructure is basically how practice is enabled. Bonaventure and the work they do at Savvy Contemporary is one such infrastructure informed by corpo-literacy, so also body knowledge and body thinking in an expanded way. Bonaventure shared projects that he has done which are associated intrinsically with the thinking and practice of musicians such as Julius Eastman, musician-composer such as Julius Eastman, and Halim Eldab, who's also a scholar, of course, and sort of looking at a certain kind of African cosmopolitanism and thinking about music in a certain way where he says, for instance, the world is not legible, but it is audible. What does it mean to deal with acts of de-erasure against the amnesia of institutional memories when these sort of thinkers are basically written out in various ways such that a different history of minimal music evolves? And how can we become kind of engrossed in their practice, not as a history, but as a sort of continuing composition in our times? And I'd conclude also with the fact that, since we have a lot of practitioners who are here, who are living between places, we're sort of living between the cracks and are diasporic. It's a condition that is sort of also coming out of various political urgencies to sort of become diasporic practitioners. And so due to this as well, to cite Fred Moten and sort of Glissant, in thinking about moving away from the heroic radical singularity, which is also the condition when one thinks of oneself having a very specific territorial makeup, to think otherwise, to think about the consent not to be a single being, and what that actually means in terms of our proliferation of our thinking and our impact. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Kavita Singh, who is a professor of art history and dean at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU, where she teaches courses on the history of Indian painting, on curating, and on the history and politics of museums. She has published extensively with essays ranging from issues on colonial history to repatriation, secularism and religiosity, fraught national identities, and memorialization of difficult histories as they relate to museums in South Asia and beyond. Her writing has always been complemented by a wide range of discursive formats and of exhibition making, and a lot of us have studied under her in different ways, and this is also thanks to her generosity as an organizer beyond the sort of university context, and sort of really being key in terms of also working across different generations of practitioners. There are some young curators from CISA, which Khoj and Goethe Institute organize, and Kavita has been also key within those formats. So thank you so much for being there for all of us, and welcome.
Thank you very much that you even thought of calling me. I also am very, very excited to be here because of Natasha, because although we can't afford to do that really, but because I have the mic right now, I'm going to take part of the credit for what she is, because she was our student. And even if she is what she is, but we are so delighted to be able to make some small claim on her because she passed through our doors. And yeah, so, it's really exciting. Of course, Natasha is not the only person. I'm not going to now start naming the many luminaries who are in this room, whom we can all kind of like say, I knew him before he was famous. So that's one of the great benefits of teaching in an institution. It's been very stimulating for me the last couple of days, particularly because so much of what has gone before what I'm going to say has a huge contrast with the case study that I'm going to present for you. And I think the sharpest contrast came actually in Erin Gleason's presentation, which, as Natasha was saying, showed us how a number of artists or academics or activists actually find themselves in a situation where they have to be infrastructure. There is no infrastructure, but there is a desire, a thirst, a passion, a sense of mission, and you just force into being just by will that which you want to see in existence in the world, because there is nothing to support it. And what I'm going to speak about actually is the exact inverse of that situation, where we have an infrastructure, we have an institution, we have funds, we have collections, and we have no will within them. And what happens in that kind of situation? Right, which is all our museums, but I'm going to take us into the museum that I know well because I live in the city that is unfortunate enough to be blessed with its presence, the National Museum in Delhi, right? So why the National Museum can't? And the sentence is incomplete because why can't it? Pretty much anything it should do. Why can't it do any of those things? Why can't it keep its collections well? Why can't it document them? Why can't they make information about what they have public? Why can't they serve an educational function? Why can't they be what they're supposed to be? It is an incredibly frustrating, depressing, and disturbing thing for us to see how the museum is sunk in this kind of morass. It's something that was started in 1948, fresh with all the ideals of a newly independent country, and it has turned into this morgue for art. And it's sunk into this morass for all kinds of reasons. I can't go into all of them. There's, of course, the usual bureaucratization. There is something about the quality of the human resource being what it is, which is not accidental. I think it is as poor as it is by design. There is an institutional design for it. It's also because there is a very peculiar notion built into our governmental employment systems about what is accountability. And so we are only accountable for the mistakes we make or the damage we do. We are not held accountable for not doing anything. So when a position was actually open in the National Museum and one of the curators asked me to apply, and he says, you know the great thing, Kavita, if you get the job, you never have to work again. This is a curator in the National Museum who's selling this position to me, because the safest thing to do is to not do anything at all once you have the job, because if you don't do anything, there's no chance of making mistakes. So that has become the default option for how our institutions are working. And of course, there's a tremendous pressure of politics within the institution. Now, this is the National Museum. It's a stone's throw from the parliament. It's a stone's throw from the ministry building. So, of course, there is a macro politics, and the way that actually plays a part, or it builds a pressure on what the museum is supposed to do, what it's supposed to represent, how it's supposed to represent, what are the limits on what it can say. But of course, within the institution, there is the micropolitics as well. And the micropolitics can have a more deadening effect than the macropolitics, because a minister can tell you X has to be done, but if deputy keeper doesn't want it to be done, deputy keeper can find 3 reasons to hold up the project, right? And the micropolitics that happens when you have a whole bunch of people who are not very good at their job or not very keen on their jobs, that can really affect even those 2, 3, 4 people who have accidentally been hired who are actually good and keen, right? So it has a deadening kind of effect all in all. Now, how this kind of plays up within the institution, we know it's a kind of permanent state of stasis, but I'd like to tell you how it plays up when some of us, through various circumstances at particular moments in the history of the institution, wander in as guest curators. And we try to make something happen. Now, of course, when an occasion like that arises, it is because there is some pressure from many powerful institutions to force this institution to actually host something, to make something possible, to start some project or exhibition which injects life into the institution. So one instance that I want to talk about is a very recently concluded exhibition called India and the World, History in 9 Stories, which was a joint project between some Indian foundations, I'll tell you in a minute whom, and the British Museum. So there's this British Museum, which is this very big universal museum. And as a universal museum, it's coming under a lot of scrutiny and pressure and criticism nowadays for what does your universal mean, and whom does your universal include? Is it not just a colonial museum, which is calling itself universal to make itself feel good? So some of the things that were instituted under this very visionary director that the British Museum had, Neil McGregor, was to try and think about the logics and the ethical premise of a universal museum today. And part of it was the sharing of collections. So to take the universal collections of the Universal Museum and move them around to other locations which don't have privy to these very broad-ranging historical collections from different civilizations. And they struck a working relationship with the largest museum in Mumbai, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya, or as I like to say, the museum formerly known as Prince, because it used to be the Prince of Wales Museum. So in that, Okay, so they had this deal going where they would have an exhibition in which various Indian collections, primarily the National Museum, would lend a lot of material from Indian history, and it would be juxtaposed with objects from world history from the British Museum collections. And the two co-curators who were put in charge of developing the narrative and the way the museum, the exhibition flowed, was someone called J.D. Hill, who's the head of research in the British Museum, and my colleague Naman Ahuja, who teaches at JNU and has curated a number of very remarkable exhibitions. So they do this exhibition in Mumbai, and some of the canonical objects actually are lent by the British Museum to this manifestation in Mumbai, like this Roman copy of a very famous Greek sculpture that comes, that's installed in the central rotunda, sort of informing the Mumbai audience even before they come into the exhibition that the greatest hits of art history are in your town. And then you go into the exhibition, and there's a very interesting series of juxtapositions, what Naman, I think, very nicely called objects in conversation, where you have two things that are sort of manifestations of a similar impulse, but which find different form in different cultures and civilizations. It's a large exhibition, I won't go into it, but you see here the staging of two pillar fragments which come from Persepolis over here, and you see how they are presented. You have, let's say, a gallery that talks about maritime trade along the Indian Ocean, and you have all kinds of objects in cases, objects that were traded across the seas. And you have a very nice graphic on the floor which places the vitrines inside the blueprint of a boat. So you have a sense of this movement and this ceaseless interchange that happens. So of course, this is an exhibition that is not just looking at a world history of art, but at how the world was in conversation through history, and how objects actually can help to track these historical conversations. And a section at the end when Aman goes all philosophical, as he's wont to do, where he talks about the nature of time and whether it's cyclic or linear. And he had a range of interesting objects which show different people's visualizations of time itself, right? So the exhibition in Mumbai was gorgeous, as I think you could see from the couple of slides I've brought you. It brought a very large number of objects into display, but also into conversation with each other. The text was very astute. It was also interlayered with a lot of videos where you had curators of different kinds speaking about the works and how they relate to each other. And the exhibition was also occasion for a series of events, including many walkthroughs, some of which I think, very interestingly for an Indian museum, brought a lot of attention to the design of the exhibition, because here you have an invitation card for a walkthrough by the exhibition designer, who was an architect based in Mumbai called Brinda Somaya. And just next to it, you have another invitation card for a walkthrough, which was being done by, I think his name is Dhruvajyoti Ghosh, who was the lighting designer. And the lighting played a huge role in the effectiveness of this exhibition. Now, when the exhibition was mounted in Mumbai, a lot of us didn't bother to book our tickets to Mumbai, because we said, of course, National Museum has lent so many works, it's going to come to Delhi as well. And Naman said, don't be so sure. So some of us had the good sense to actually dash across and see the exhibition over there. Because once the exhibition actually did decide to travel to Delhi, and this was done belatedly and in a hurry, what we actually saw of the exhibition in Delhi made us sort of deeply regret that it had ever made the move at all. Because, oops, I've gone one back in front of forward. Because when the exhibition comes to Delhi, I mean, I just have to show you the inauguration function and the people on the dais for you to get the picture, right? So up there we have the inaugural function in the National Museum auditorium, in which there is like someone from the Ministry of Culture, there's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's the director of the National Museum. Where is Mr. Naman Ahuja, the really dynamic curator? He's in London. And he's in London that day, I think. I mean, he says it's a long-standing commitment that he had, but we're among friends here, right? So he's in London because he's so upset because he's written out of the exhibition. When the contract is drawn up by the CSMVS to travel the exhibition to the National Museum, they don't have any place for Naman at all in their plan. They don't have a budget for him. He doesn't exist. And when he says, what is my role in this exhibition? They say, none, you've done your work. We don't need you anymore. And what about the lovely lighting designer and the lovely exhibition designer who have already engaged with these objects, already have a deep understanding, already have a lot of materials ready that can be picked up and put in the place? We don't need them also because we have our own in-house expertise. So we are going to do fine without any of you. Thank you very much. And this is the exhibition that they produce. I mean, I cannot, unfortunately, there's something about the phone cameras which they make everything look good. They make your food look good. They make you look good. They're even making this wretched exhibition look not as bad as it was. It was horrible. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Right? It was crowded. It was messy. I'm just going to show you a close-up of this case for you to see the fabulous lighting design. Right? All you could see are these crappy cases with their horrible thick joints and the lights just casting shadows on the object. It was unbelievably bad. It was so shabby. The walls were peeling. The exhibit labels had stuff that was wrong, which just had sticky tape on it to obscure things. I mean, it was just, and the logic of the exhibition, the flow, the relationship between the text and the objects, all of that was lost. And it didn't have to be. They had something ready in Mumbai. They just didn't want to maybe pay a little extra to get those people to come into work for 2 weeks to adapt the design to the Delhi galleries. And they thought that what they are doing is good enough. This is absolutely extraordinary to me. Now, in addition to the badness of the design, there were also some very interesting exclusions in the exhibition. The number of things did not travel. Right? Yeah. So, the Discobolus didn't come. The British Museum didn't want to travel it. And because that didn't come, this work by a Chinese contemporary artist, which was a take on the Discobolus, full-size version of him wearing a Mao suit, that made no sense, so that didn't come either, right? And then this very celebrated contemporary sculpture by Ellen Tallur, which plays with the historical form of the Nataraj and embeds it in concrete and money, that didn't come either. And neither were these Japanese scrolls on display. These are just some of the things. I think there were 12 or 14 objects that were not on display in Delhi, which had been on display in Mumbai. So the Discobolus, it seems that the British Museum didn't want to lend it for that long. That didn't come. As Meera Menezes, who's here with us today, wrote in a very sharp article, a number of these exclusions seemed quite significant. And unlike other journalists who just commented on it, Meera actually sort of pursued the director until he made a statement about why it hadn't come. And he said, so he said, I love this, we, the professional heritage lovers. Right? So we know what professional lovers are, so we are professional heritage lovers. Should not trivialize the Anand Tandav of Lord Shiva, who is the embodiment of the cosmic underpinning, having creation arising from his drum, protection from the hand of hope, destruction from the hand holding fire, foot held aloft giving release. This version may be a significant artwork by the artist, but in the context of history and culture, it is against the depiction of the Nataraj, right? So this is ideological censorship, right? So Meera has even a further postscript to add, but we can go into that later. She can share with us. But this is the reason the director of the National Museum gives for excluding a work of art, that he just doesn't think it's respectful enough to Indian culture. Another set of objects that was not over there was actually these Japanese scrolls. So amazingly, you go past this case which has a Chinese scroll. This is in the Gallery of Court Culture. So you have this Chinese scroll. And you come up on this big case, and in that case, suddenly there are 2 framed Mughal prints from the gift shop in tacky frames with the printed captions showing. And you're like, why is this here? And you ask Naman, and Naman tells you it was supposed to have these 2 Japanese scrolls, which had actually traveled to Delhi for the show, but the National Museum had painted the inside of the case so recently that the fumes were still in there. So the conservator said, you cannot show our scrolls in there. So they just, had an empty case. They just slapped something, a museum that has like 1 million objects of its own. It just slapped 2 things from the gift shop in there. And most beautiful is that the curator's video explaining the Japanese scroll was running alongside for the whole duration of the show. Right? So this is going on. Okay. So, and this lady. So those of you who are not from India wouldn't know how important she is in our history. So there's this 3rd millennium to 2nd millennium BC civilization, which we are all very proud of, but it has very little figurative sculpture. And one of the figurative sculptures that was produced, which survives, is this tiny little bronze figure, which has been called a dancing girl for no good reason. I won't go into that. Naman has a theory about that as well. But this was on display in the Bombay exhibition. Now, in the Mumbai exhibition, they had a replica. The object belongs to the National Museum. Okay, they think it's too precious to travel even to Mumbai. They don't show it. They ask the Mumbai Museum to put up a replica. They put up a replica. What do they do in Delhi? This is a photograph from a textbook. Gives you an idea of the original object. Take a good look. And this is what they put up in Delhi. Yeah? A replica and a worse replica. Like, apparently they had offered this to Mumbai, and when Naman saw it, he said, I'm not showing this. So they hunted around for someone who had bought a replica in the 1950s, so it was at least better quality, and they put that up. In Delhi, they put up this hideous thing, and please don't miss that blob of blue tack in her crotch to hide the vulva. I mean, what are we doing? What is the National Museum doing? I don't have words. I just don't have words for the thinking in this museum. So, Meera, you wrote about the censorship of the big sculpture, but there's also the bikini put on our dancing girl. You know? It's also censorship. I mean, I'm just aghast, right? Now, not only do they do this, but I know that everyone in the museum actually really has their knives out for Naman. Because they are so resentful of his international success, his cosmopolitanism, the fact that he's the one who gets these, they have the objects, but he gets to be the curator. So that's partly why, not partly, that's mainly why they would have left him out of the exhibition in the first place. Also because he has very high standards where installation is concerned, and they certainly didn't want him butting in on their very highly competent capacities, right? So, yeah, the professional lovers as opposed to the amateur lovers, right? Okay, so here we have it. Now, this is how it plays out when an outside curator comes to the National Museum, right? So 3 years ago, a friend and I got a chance to do something in the National Museum. And we knew all the problems that are likely to come. So we tried to tiptoe around them. Now, what was this chance that we got? 3 years ago, we got the opportunity to mount an exhibition which was also from the National Museum's collections. And it was an exhibition called Norus, The Many Arts of the Deccan. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that means. My friend Preeti Bahadur Ramaswamy and I were the co-curators, and this was an exhibition which had objects entirely from the National Museum's collection, but we stepped in to do selections, to make a narrative, to produce the texts, and to oversee the design and so on, but with cooperation from the museum. These are some of the galleries of the exhibition. It had different kinds of materials. We had a lot of textiles, we had arms and armor, we had metalware, we had fabulous manuscripts. I'll show you a few of them as we went on. And the reason for that exhibition was actually this exhibition, which is a spectacular, show-stopping exhibition that was mounted at the Metropolitan Museum in 2016 on the art of the Deccan. Now, what is the Deccan? The Deccan is the northern peninsular part of India, and it is an area in which there were some sultanates ruling. I mean, there were many, obviously, polities at many times, but there is a period from about the 14th century to the 18th century when there are these sultanates that are ruling and that are fighting with each other all the time. So borders are constantly shifting. The Mughals want to conquer them. So there is constant warfare on the northern front. And there is a tremendous amount of trade because of the coastline. There is a tremendous amount of production of beautiful objects, which actually helped India in the 18th century to corner 25% of the world's international trade economy. So there is a lot that is going on in the Deccan at this time, and yet because it is a time and a place which has a great deal of movement, a great deal of fighting, a great deal of immigrants, where you have elites from Persia, from Central Asia, from Ethiopia becoming important rulers and commanders in this area, it is also something that doesn't fit into a national narrative. Because it's too hybrid, it's too cosmopolitan, there are too many shifting cultural zones, and force fields over here for it to fit into a neat story. As a result of which there has been hardly any scholarship in the area. And so when the Metropolitan Museum, under the leadership of the Islamic arts curator Nabina Najat Haider, developed a major project to do a big Art of the Deccan exhibition. Oh no. We in India got terribly excited about it. And we thought, we're not going to get something like that exhibition over here. So let us at least have a conference. So we called Navina to speak, and we called other scholars who work on the Deccan to speak. And while we were planning this conference, which was sponsored by a foundation, a private foundation, the lady who runs that foundation, that's Renu Judge, said, why don't we also do an exhibition along with the conference? Let's ask the National Museum if they have any Deccani objects, and let's put them on show. Now, it was possible to ask the National Museum because at that moment, almost by accident, we had Venugopal, this brilliant bureaucrat who for 1 year shook up the museum and really made it function well. And so Venu actually really made it possible for us to do the exhibition because he was able to then order the curator that they have to cooperate with us. We also had a very important member of our team. There was Arun Das, who was our designer. I think one of the wires is not like this, these lines. Is it because a wire is loose? No? Okay. And for us, it was very, very important to have the cooperation of the different keepers of the different departments. Now, these are not articulate people. These are not people who have social capital. These may not even be people who know their objects or their, the history of their objects terribly well in all cases. But we knew we needed them to be on our side, otherwise we would be left with little shreds to show in the exhibition. So we decided to make them co-authors and to give them credit everywhere. So they wrote the catalog entries. It's another matter that we had to heavily edit them, but we got them to sign all of them. We got them to participate in the symposium. We got them to lead curatorial walks so that they would feel that they are also included in the process of the exhibition. And I think that paid off, because they started finding us objects which were just beyond spectacular. Like this is a 17th century textile tent panel, right? Priyanka, let me have 5 more minutes because there are objects, right? 5 extra minutes. So this, I don't know, those of you who don't know how kalamkari is done, it's an absolutely insane process where they have to dye each color. So they actually will paint with the mordant, which is going to fix the paint rather than the color itself. So they're painting maybe in some shades of gray, which is what the mordant is. And then everything that they don't want to be in that color, they have to cover with either mud or wax so that it doesn't get that. So you can imagine one bird, how many times it has to be mordanted and resisted to produce this. And the complexity of this piece, I can't begin to tell you. So, the decorative arts curator brought us things like this. She found us this 10-meter long embroidered panel from, it is embroidered. I brought one close up so you can see the number of stitches in it. It was like spectacular. They were taking out these things that we never thought the National Museum would have anything in it that was worth showing in a Deccani exhibition, and this stuff started rolling out. Amazing manuscript. Persian translation in the Deccan in the 17th century of a 14th century Arabic encyclopedia of the universe. So starting from the stars and the angels in the sky down to things that are under the depths of the ocean, and 3-4 illustrations on every page, 500-page manuscript. It was just like amazing. There were beautiful paintings. What we didn't have in the exhibition at all was jewelry, because the jewelry curator, under repeated pressure from us, because we're saying the Deccan had the earliest diamond mines, you must have some Deccani jewelry. But he, under pressure, poor fellow, he didn't know a thing about his department. He pulled out some things, and we couldn't at all be sure they were from the Deccan. So we had to exclude all the jewelry because we just didn't have the expertise to know, right? So anyway, we saw all the kind of material that they pulled out, and Preeti and I developed a narrative which had various thematic sections. The sections were not by material, but by different kinds of historical themes. For example, the Deccan was very well known for very inventive metalware. So we had a series on speaking objects in which you had some kind of copper and vessels which had amazing engraving and calligraphy. Yeah, I know, like it was just amazing. You had a Bidriware hookah base, which actually had scenes from the Padmavat epic, that's been in the news so much on it. You had a storyline about how tobacco enters India through the Deccan, through Portuguese traders coming to Deccan coast. And so all the technology of smoking that is developed, depictions of people who are smoking, and how smoking spreads from the elite to the popular levels, where you have these women who've set up a smoke shop and people are kind of rioting to get to their chance with a hookah, right? So yeah, and then this was about North Indian devotees of Krishna in the Deccan and how they adapt their ritual needs to the available crafts, as well as possibly the spread of interest in Krishna's going to Persian reading people, because you have a manuscript of the story of Krishna written in Persian. We had a whole section, this textile. So this textile didn't exactly fit the Deccan, and we said we have to make it fit, because we are not having the show without it once we've seen it. So we spun this story. It's not untrue, but we used a fantastic scholarly essay by someone called Philip Waggoner, who talks about the Vijayanagar kingdom and how the architecture of the temples was very much in the Hindu temple mode, but the architecture of the palaces was in the Islamic Sultanate mode, because the Sultanate mode was the language of power in visual culture. And so we point to how there is a bit of that here as well. So that was a very thin peg on which we managed to get this textile into the exhibition, right? And the name of the exhibition actually comes from a ruler whose nom de plume was Nauras Shah, or the king of the 9 rasas. Rasa is aesthetic sentiments. And he was a music-mad king. And he composed, many of the portraits of him show him actually playing or singing, playing instruments or singing. And for us, this collection of his songs had a verse which was like our epigraph, where he says, our tongues might all be different, but we feel the same emotions, we express the same emotions kaha Turk, kaha Brahman. So whether we are Turkish or whether we are Brahmins. And the person who is truly fortunate is the one on whom Saraswati gives her blessings, right? So that we are blessed with knowledge and understanding. And the frontispiece of the collection of his poems actually has a portrait of Saraswati in it. And he calls himself the son of Saraswati, right? So here's an Islamic king who calls himself the son of the Hindu goddess of learning, which for us was gold. And the National Museum had a few pages from this manuscript, the Kitab-i-Nauras, which has his poems. So we were very proud to display them. And the idea of the cosmopolitanism, the hybridity, the mixing of these cultures, the fact that there is a place where Brahmin and Turk can meet, that became very important for the exhibition. I remind you, this exhibition was mounted in the National Museum in 2015. We had just got our blessed new government in 2014. So this was an important thing for us to be able to do. But that's the exciting part. And then there is also the frustrating, the depressing, the disappointing part, which is the behind the scenes part. So when we're actually handling these objects, our designer was designing the exhibition. We had requested the keepers to give us preventive conservation guidelines for how things should be displayed. What are the do's and don'ts for every object? None of that came. When the design was actually presented to them, again, there were no interventions. Orun had wanted to enliven this object by making it turn a corner. I was begging him, not a sharp corner, it's a textile, let it go gently. So he curved the corner, which is great. But I was in the museum the night that they were mounting this, and this carpenter with grubby hands comes with his hammer and starts driving nails here. And I started saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm not actually doing anything to the textile, and he's doing this with his hands. I'm not damaging the textile, I'm only doing the border, right? And like, so we're begging him, ki, please, file down a piece of wood, bend this over the support, and put the nails on that piece of wood, which will extend like beyond the width of the part that, we're begging him to do that. I must say, I actually cried at that moment when I saw him putting his hands on the textile. And it really makes you wonder, what is the trade-off between, constantly complaining about these things being inside the store, nobody being able to enjoy them, and actually brings them out to be put up by people like this, right? I felt that we had damaged certain things. This was that fantastic encyclopedia, and because we could only show one page at a time, Arun had this idea that we'd show creatures coming out of the object and covering the walls, and then of course we had an iPad where you could turn the pages. But after 3 or 4 days, 2 or 3 people started complaining that this very precious manuscript is outside and it's too flat. It wasn't entirely flat, but it wasn't like this, it was like this. And they said it's going to damage the binding. And the director got spooked and he removed it. So we put a dummy, we put a digital reproduction for the rest of the show. There were 2 or 3 problems, like a painting fell down inside the case and the lower edge got damaged. And this is because the fabrication of all the display materials was in the National Museum's hands. And the fabrication was rather poor quality. So you had nice design ideas and it's being marred by sort of plexiglass, which is wavy, which is scratched, So that was also a frustration that you can't actually get the interaction with the objects that you would have liked. But despite all the problems and all the misgivings, it was still a big high to be able to put out an exhibition like that, to be able to talk about hybridity, cosmopolitanism, this kind of cross-pollination, at that time. And we also had a fantastic response from other creative people who came and did concerts, who did storytelling performances. We had a lot of walkthroughs with different people, and there was a fantastic and exciting response and many conversations which built up over that, which made me feel that still, there is something wonderful to be said for projects like this, despite whatever misgivings one might have. The only other doubt that I wanted to share with you is that we were quite conscious of how everything that we are saying about these objects and the cultural context that they come out of is true. The Deccan was cosmopolitan. There were elites from local communities. There were local converts to Islam, but there were also Hindu noblemen who became very powerful. There were Abyssinians who became very powerful. There were Persians who became very powerful. So there is no indigenous Deccani. And it wasn't even the point, right? The Deccan had greater connections with lands across the seas on either side than with what it's territorially connected to, because they were always at war with the guys to their north, right? So there is all of that. Ibrahim Adil Shah, this fantastic sultan who calls himself the son of Saraswati, he exists, right? But also, we have a lot of scholarly work which tells us things that we don't necessarily want in 2015 to be saying in public. So one of the major books that was done on the Deccan actually is this fantastic book that is quite a recent one, which talks about power, memory, and architecture, and it talks about contested sites. And it actually talks about what we call reuse in historical parlance, but it actually means somebody comes in, breaks down the structures of the previous dynasty, and incorporates bits of that into their own. And so, of course, there's that hot button topic over here, which is the destruction of temples, and the use of those stone fragments either in mosques or in palaces of the next dynasty that exerts its power over these places, or sometimes just the conversion of an entire site, which has one meaning, into another site. Now, this we did not talk about in the exhibition, right? And I felt that when we are making certain kinds of public addresses, the way we talk about history and the kind of nuance that we would use to talk about history in an academic setting, they are actually two different things. And I still don't feel sure about how honest I feel about having done that. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to pick